Morning everyone, welcome to researchEDHome. This morning we have Tarjinder Gill with us, who is a primary specialist. She has been teaching in primary schools for a very long time, and she's going to share with us her experience and her advice on teaching spelling. So it's going to be a very informative session. I can see that most attendees have now started joining, so perhaps without further ado, Tarjinder, if you're ready, would you like to take over?
Am I already on, or do I have to do something?
You are on.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, you can tell I've not done this before. Okay, so hello, my name's Tarjinder, and I've been teaching in primary for what can only be described as donkey years, and I've taught in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 as well, and a lot of what I'm going to present is just my current thinking on teaching English in general, but also teaching spelling more specifically. So let me just share my presentation with you. So that's just my Twitter handle and my blog site, and I will be posting these slides on there later on.
We can't, sorry, Tarjinder, we can't see the slide.
Can you not see the slide? Sorry, hang on, I've not shared the screen yet. Oh, sorry.
That's it?
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So, sorry, just to say that again, that includes, this slide just includes my Twitter handle and my blog site, and I will be posting all my slides on there later on. So just to launch into it, a lot of my thinking about English recently has been how we teach English overall, particularly with the idea of having a knowledge-rich curriculum. What does that actually mean for English, and what does that mean for English in primary? And if you've ever been on one of those sort of MPQ courses, what they always have is this, this sort of diagram that shows that if you want a successful project, you need to have various aspects to it. Well, there's various components to it, and if you have them all, great, you will have a successful project. However, if there's one aspect that's missing, what tends to happen is that your project doesn't go well. So what's happening? And I kind of use that thinking to try and create this diagram. Now it's not, create this table, but it's not complete as such. It's just my thinking at the moment. And I think we need to really think in primary, if children don't have a particular aspect or a component to their knowledge in terms of English, they struggle to become literate adults. So what is happening here? And all this is really showing is that, well, if you're missing some aspect, what are the knock-on effects? And often the knock-on effects are both for reading and for writing. And that's why it's really important to teach the different component parts. It's not always clear where you're going with it, but the fact is that you are going somewhere. And one of the aspects that I've noticed with reading more and more in these areas is that they're all all these different areas are just self-reinforcing. And sometimes we can get sort of caught up with the self-reinforcing aspect of it, but I don't think we need to. I think we just need to focus on teaching that core knowledge in these different areas. So what am I really going to go through in terms of presentation, in terms of spelling? Well, first of all, I'm just going to look at, quickly look at the barriers to extended writing and how spelling fits in there. Then what knowledge we are expected to teach for spelling. Now, I call this common teacher misconceptions, but I think it'd be common misconceptions for staff, and I could probably have named this my teacher misconceptions, to be fair, because I managed to accumulate a fair few of them over the sort of course of 15 years. And I think if we're going to teach spelling effectively, we do need to address these. And then just to have a look at where my thinking is in terms of teaching spelling currently, and where I think we can go with it, particularly in primary, given the objectives that we have and the curriculum that we have at the moment. And then just to look long term, what would we want to have in a knowledge-rich spelling curriculum? So anybody who's seen any of my sort of recent presentations knows that I keep banging on about the barriers to extended writing, and they are the three, which is handwriting, spelling, and sentence construction. And that comes from the Education Endowment Fund research, but it also research, but it also comes from I think my own experience of teaching writing and what is really holding those children back, particularly those low prior attainers, or however you want to refer to them. What is it that keeps getting in the way of them really being able to write good extended pieces? And these three things are consistent barriers. And if they haven't achieved a certain amount of automaticity or fluency within these, then they will continue to struggle. Now, while I don't think that English is a vertical subject in terms of the way that knowledge is organised, I think there is an aspect to it in terms of its basic sort of foundational stage that is. And you need to have certain aspects of knowledge to create that foundation to really be able to build on it. And then it kind of becomes more of a horizontal subject. So I think it's a bit more, I think English is a bit more complex, less straightforward in that respect. Also, before I sort of move on, I do think that English is different again, because it's not just a subject domain in the same way that history is, because you can treat the literature aspect in that way, but we do have this this knowledge which doesn't just belong to English as a subject, it belongs to children. They need to learn it in order to be able to access all the other subjects, and that makes English special in its own way. So what knowledge are we looking at? Now, this is basically a diagram based on the national curriculum for primary. It would look slightly different in secondary. However, where spelling fits in is that it's a transcriptional skill alongside handwriting, as opposed to the compositional skills. Again, if we look at the knowledge that is actually being taught, and this is across primary, so this includes EYFS as well, what I would have referred to as spelling patterns, and I will talk about the terminology in a bit more detail later as well. Really, we're talking about grapheme phoneme correspondences. I think we do need to look at them as that. I think treating spelling as though it's just a visual, it's this visual skill is not helpful, because we do need to make that link between what they're looking at and what it sounds like. And I think part of the problem is that link is broken. So they're developing it now in early years in Key Stage 1, and then it kind of breaks from Key Stage 2 onwards, and that's a problem in itself if we're talking about those children who are struggling or who have gaps in their knowledge. But essentially, spelling is broken into three aspects. What we could refer to as spelling patterns, but I will argue are just grapheme phoneme correspondences. And then you've got the morphological element of it, which is the prefixes and suffixes. And then we also have a component which is to teach a certain set of words, which are in Key Stage 1 common exception words, and in Key Stage 2 statutory spellings. We also have homophones and near homophones that we teach, because these are common spellings that children get incorrect. So we're talking about there, and there kind of thing, and which and which. I've put etymology on the side because you're not really teaching lessons in etymology per se. It sort of infuses itself throughout all of this. And so when you're teaching children the origins of words, that depends on what you're teaching at a particular point in time. And I think it's just something you have to be mindful of in the background while you're creating the spelling curriculum, but also while you're teaching it. But I don't think it fits in specifically as a body of knowledge per se. And this is just a diagram to show roughly what's happening. What kind of knowledge do we need to get the children to be able to become good spellers? Certainly one of the problems that we do have in terms of creating literate adults, or children who become literate adults, is that there is this thing of, oh, well, I'm just not a good speller. And where is that coming from? And it's because we're not sort of always giving children those key components of the knowledge that they need. We do need to have the sort of basic idea of phonological awareness, but the key part of that would be phonemic awareness, both for reading and for writing. They need the ability to decode and encode words. They need to know the alphabet. Now, whether they know the names of the alphabet is something that different people have differing opinions on when they need to have it, but I do think they do need to learn the names at some point. Certainly as a Year 6 teacher, I don't want to be sort of distinguishing between different GPCs just by writing them out, or by sort of trying to describe them in some other way. It is quite simple. If the bit of the spelling that is wrong is they should have spelt it with the grapheme IGH, then that's what you want to tell them. And it's easy to just be able to tell the child across the room that's actually, that's the bit you're struggling with, and that's how it's spelt. They need letter formation because it's reinforcing. They need to know their one-to-one correspondences. But as we move on to more complex spellings, more complex words, they do need to have an understanding of digraphs, trigraphs, and multigraphs, and that's something part of that they will be taught along the way in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. Their knowledge of syllables, well, they'll already have learned that and reinforced it when they're learning sort of those concepts of phonological awareness. But actually, when it comes into its own is when we move from monosyllabic words to polysyllabic words, because again, another aspect of teaching spelling that I think I got wrong for a long time was actually, how do I teach polysyllabic words? I was sort of treating them as monosyllabic words almost, and then you know, obviously the number of letters in a word, the more complex vocabulary that you teach, it gets harder to treat them and teach them in the same way. And then we move on to grapheme phoneme correspondences that are rare or unusual. And morphology and etymology is, in terms of teaching it, it does go from simple to complex itself as we go along, as we're teaching spelling from Key Stage 2 onwards. Now, unlike our secondary colleagues, we actually do have, if I just go briefly back to this slide, we in primary do have an awful lot of spelling objectives, which I think in some ways is a good thing, because I think obviously we're teaching the basics and they need to know it, but in some ways it means that we don't have much flexibility or room for manoeuvre. If I was to sort of redo the national curriculum, I probably would take away the statutory spellings and just have us teaching the code, from the initial code to the complex code to the more rare grapheme phoneme correspondences. But that's not within sort of, you know, I don't have the power to do that, but I think that would make more logical sense. So what are some of the common teacher misconceptions? And I think we need to go through these quite, not necessarily in huge depth, but actually just to think, why have these arisen? Personally, I think part of the reason why I had these misconceptions is because I was trying to teach myself how to teach spelling. I didn't really get much in terms of teacher training, like about how to teach spelling. Plus, there's a lot of confused ideas out there, and if you're just grabbing bits here and there from different websites, from different bits of training, it becomes quite confusing quite early on. And also, depending on the school that I was working in, I either didn't teach spelling at all, I just gave it out as homework, or I just sort of went over sort of a look, cover, write sheet and expected the children to kind of rote learn. And I will be returning to that issue of rote learning spellings as well later on. So let's look at the first idea: spelling can't be taught. So where does that kind of come from? Well, it's part of it is because we have this kind of confusing array of ideas about spelling rules and spelling patterns, and then sort of let's throw grapheme phoneme correspondences into the mix as well. And where does this all fit in, and where does it come from? And I think at times what we would have referred to as spelling patterns really are just grapheme phoneme correspondences. And I think we need, moving forward, that's how I view them. Like I said, spelling is not a purely visual exercise. It is about the correspondence between what they're reading and how it sounds. And where do spelling rules fit in? Well, I'll just have a quick look at this here. Just before I move on. So what are we actually teaching? Well, actually, if you think about what we're teaching in the different year groups, the one-to-one correspondences are really in reception. And while we might reinforce them as we go along, that's not what we're teaching, even though they're the most common ones, and that's what we're looking at. And then you've got the sort of what we call regular spelling patterns, but really we're talking about the complex code here, and some parts of the initial code too. And again, that kind of ends in Key Stage 1. Now, why some people might think that spelling can't be taught is because if you look at it, really, with Key Stage 2 in particular, you can see why if you just had these words to teach, it's quite easy to look at it and go, well, there doesn't seem to be much logic to this. But actually, what we're really teaching is the more irregular, what we refer to as irregular spelling patterns, or what I would call rare or unusual grapheme phoneme correspondences. So it's quite easy to go, well, hang on, there's no regularity here, there's no logic here. Can it even really be taught? Or do we just have to rote learn a whole load of words? And so that was part of why I think I had that misconception, is because I'm literally looking at words that don't fit into a pattern, whereas it is the teachers sort of early on who are teaching those regularities. I can't remember where I got the statistic from, I would have to look at this again, but really, if you look at the initial and the complex code, 85% of words that we spell are regular. If you've got that knowledge. It is only about 15% of words that are from other countries, or from other languages that we've incorporated, that cause this situation to occur. So if we're looking at those and saying, well, hang on, where does that fit in with these other spellings? Well, they kind of don't, and we just have to accept that that's a function, that's just how our language is and how it's evolved over time, but not to treat that as a barrier to teaching spelling, but just to see those words and those graphemes for what they are. So where does the idea of spelling rules come in? Well, really, that's only referring to the morphological aspect, and really then only we're really referring to suffixes. So things like plurals, we're changing verb tenses, and things like comparatives and superlatives. So that's kind of where spelling rules fit in. And I think sometimes what the idea was, oh, well, there must be spelling rules for everything. And it kind of got very confusing, because then not only did you have spelling rules, but you've got exceptions to those spelling rules. And it's not particularly helpful in terms of teaching children a schema or helping them to build up a schema of spelling. If we look at how that breaks down over the years, you can see that it's sort of a bit more straightforward. Now, in terms of spelling rules, again, I think there's sort of disputes. Should you teach them? Should you not? I think to some extent it comes down to the extent to which we're really asking children to add those suffixes, as opposed to just word lists of common of words that happen to have those suffixes in them. To what extent are we actually asking children to change words into other words? Are we actually asking them to use those morphological elements? To what extent do we want them to understand it? To what extent do we actually want them to change the words? Do they need that knowledge? And if they do, why? And I think with some of these words, and with when we're adding suffixes for comparatives and superlatives, I think we can argue that actually children will be coming across words that we do want them to change. And the extent to which you spend time on the spelling rules, I think, is up to you, but I don't think you need to always overemphasize them. As you move along, that element of teaching children the rules, I think, in terms of morphology, becomes less and less important. And then it sort of starts to get a bit hazy. I mean, do you really want to teach the suffix shun? And is it helpful to teach it as a rule, or do you just want them to have sort of lists of words that actually understand that that is what the spelling, that they're spelt with that particular, with those particular GPCs? And I think as you move along into years 3 and 4, and again into years 5 and 6, I do think that it becomes less and less helpful to teach rules, as opposed to teach this set of spellings, or these set of words are have this or spelt in this particular way. Now, if there is a rule, fine, but if you're finding that actually, and I'm not going to pretend that I've taught all of these objectives, because I haven't, but I think with some of them, I would find that actually the rules just aren't there. If you've got more exceptions than rules, I think if it's getting too complicated, you have to sort of say, is there a point to this or isn't there? That's a decision that you have to make. And of course, you know, sort of you then have certain objectives in the national curriculum, which I think are sort of not particularly helpful. So this idea of spelling words with silent letters, well, they're not silent. They may be rare or unusual grapheme phoneme correspondences, but they're not silent. And so you take the word night there, which is included in an example. Actually, if you go all the way back to year 2, you can see that it's already there. You've already got the grapheme phoneme correspondence, the GPC K and N together as a digraph that you use to represent the N sound. So there's no point in then turning around and teaching it as a silent letter. And I don't think that's helpful to children anyway, because they're not really silent, they're just unusual GPCs. So then comes the idea that some words can't be sounded out. So what is this idea? It's basically the idea that there are words that can be read and said, but not broken down into their grapheme phoneme correspondences. And again, I think a lot of that comes from a variety of sources. But if we actually look at what's going on, there's actually only 2 words that you spell that can't be broken down. That's A and I. And that's literally because they only have one sound. Every other word has more than one sound, and it can be broken down into its sounds. Now, whether those whether the grapheme phoneme correspondence is one-to-one, or whether it's part of the complex code, or whether it's a rare or unusual grapheme phoneme correspondence, that's really the issue here. But just because it is a rare one doesn't mean that you can't break the words down. And part of the problem that you have is when you tell children they can't break words down, and the reason why that happens is because you've got these sort of high frequency tricky words that are still being taught. So this is to do with the teaching of reading, that are being taught as sight words. And now, again, it depends on who's teaching it in the different programs. But if it's being taught that, well, you can't sound these words out, and you're being taught to read them straight, then it gives children the idea that there are words that can't be sounded out and can't be sounded out when they're spelling them. And you can understand that with some of these words, these are sort of, you know, more high frequency words. They're not your one, they don't correspond with your one-to-one correspondences, or even your initial sort of that complex code that you would more frequently use. So you've got that with a schwa in it, you've got is with a sort of sound there, which you're representing with an S, which again is unusual. You've got go, no, so. And so what you're really looking at there is that you don't have that one-to-one correspondence. So you don't have the letter O being sounded, which the one-to-one correspondence would be O, but you don't have that there. And said being another obvious example. But again, I don't think we can allow this to sort of derail us just because for some random reason, a lot of our high frequency words do happen to have rare or unusual grapheme phoneme correspondences. And part of the issue that we have is that we can turn around and tell children there are words that can't be sounded out, and that's fine. But what happens to all teachers, particularly in primary school, but I'm sure later on as well, unfortunately, is you come across this. So you can say to children that they can't sound out these words, except they have. And that's the explanation for why they've spelt them incorrectly in this situation. So kind of in your face, really, because if you're going to tell them they can't sound them out and they go ahead and sound them out, how can you actually explain this to them then? Because you're going to have to correct this somehow. And the correction can't be that you can't sound them out because they just have. So, you know, you just create a confused situation here where blatantly they've done it. So you may as well just sort of help them to create their schema and give them the knowledge they do need, which is, yes, these words can be sounded out. However, you don't have the correct grapheme phoneme correspondence. So you would break these words down there and be able to sort of show them where it is they've gone wrong. Again, we can't treat our language as though it's Italian or Spanish. One of these languages has got one-to-one correspondence. It doesn't. And I think we just have to help children to understand the complexity of that right from the get-go. Now, one of the things I would say is, while again, as teachers, if we don't have the subject knowledge, this can feel a bit overwhelming. But the truth is that we teach children about things that are common, that are unusual and rare all the time. And if we can do that when it comes to trees, if we can do that when it comes to different types of animals, if we can do that in other situations, we can do it for spelling as well. And they will just accept that there are grapheme phoneme correspondences that are used more frequently and that are used rarely. And that's all about developing their schema within spelling. This one is understandable, and I think it comes from when, again, people are treating, when they're treating our language as though we've got one-to-one correspondence all the time. So this particular misconception is something that arose when I was sort of training some people, and they were trying to help the children to break the words down. We got as far as, yeah, that's fine, you can definitely break this word down. But then they would be teaching this, the air part, and go, well, there's an a and I here. So what they've done is they basically moved away from the actual sound, and they're treating these letters as though they are making sounds, and those sounds are fixed with those letters, and they're not. These letters are just representing those sounds. That's what John Walker says. And I should say that a lot of sort of my thinking has come from John Walker in particular, who does the Sounds Right program. However, in my particular case, I wasn't able to use that particular program, but I was taking aspects of it when I was trying to teach it and thinking about creating a spelling program, and teaching it myself more recently. Now, the problem with that is that you're then just confusing the situation. I think you do have to very much stick with the idea, and he says it all the time, that, you know, letters don't make sounds, which is true, they don't. You know, we make sounds and then we represent them with letters. And so we have to make sure that that we give teachers the subject knowledge to be confident with that. Particularly in Key Stage 2 onwards, it has to be said. You know, I think still the kind of the idea of training in terms of phonics is that, well, you know, sort of early years in Key Stage 1 teachers need it, but the rest of us kind of don't. And I think that causes its own issues, because it means that we're not confident teaching it, or we can end up with a slightly all or nothing approach to teaching spelling, which is either we give children the whole word, or we ask them to sound it out, and there's a kind of frustration when they don't sound it out correctly and we're not quite sure what to do. And there's also the issue of the impact of correction. Okay, I do think that early on, part of the reason why we have children who are making a lot of spelling errors is because they're not being corrected enough. And I can understand that people feel that, well, we're trying to encourage children to write, and is it going to knock their self-esteem if we correct their spellings? But I think the fact is that we do need to correct them as early as possible. Otherwise, children will simply practice spelling words incorrectly from the get-go, and that habit is really hard to kick. It's not something that we can just fix easily as we go along. I think that whole idea of practice makes permanent is true here. You know, like actually children, I think that's open off. Actually, the more they practice it in a particular way, the more they do it. And what that means in terms of their extended writing and their overall writing is that they end up with sort of writing which is riddled with spelling errors. And then when it comes to editing it, it just becomes an impossible job. I mean, how are they supposed to do it? And the whole process of becoming a better speller and becoming a better writer just gets extended out, and it becomes harder and harder for those children. So in the short term, I think you do have to say, well, actually, how we correct children is the real issue here, not whether we do it. And we can do it in a way, we know we can, that means that we're not knocking children's self-esteem, but at the same time, they are being corrected and they aren't making those same mistakes repeatedly. The other issue here is what is phonetically plausible, and I think we all sort of seem to have had our own ideas about what phonetically plausible is. I would say now that phonetically plausible spellings, the ones that we accept, should be the spellings that we know we haven't taught the grapheme phoneme correspondences to. If we have taught them and it is reasonable, and it has to be at some point, you know, you have to sort of say, well, okay, fine, if I only taught it last week and they make the mistake, maybe it's not reasonable for them to have spelt it correctly right here and now. Fine. But I think you do have to draw a line in the sand here somewhere and say, okay, fine, if we've taught it, they should be spelling it correctly. And we have to have that insistence right from the beginning. And we also need to ensure that we correct it so the children are not making those mistakes. So what's phonetically plausible is not fixed. It's going to change over time because it depends on what knowledge the children have. But we do have to be insistent upon this. Last but not least is the issue of accuracy versus stamina. Now, if we really want children to be able to become good at extended writing and learn those composite parts, we need to give them the opportunity to practice those the component parts. But we also need to think about, to what extent is it okay for children just to write inaccurately? To what extent is it okay for children to write a whole page riddled with spelling errors, riddled with grammar errors, and how are they supposed to correct those? Because it just gets harder and harder. And I think there has to be something that tells us that early on, we need to get children to write little but frequently and be more accurate, and sort of follow those principles that Engelman has, which is that actually what you're doing is you're building them up towards extended writing. Just practicing the outcome is not going to get you the outcome. What happens in those situations is you've got children, and I think the idea is if they're free and they write, they'll enjoy writing, and then they'll somehow magically get better, and that just doesn't happen. I think every year 6 teacher can attest to that, to be perfectly honest. At the moment, most teachers can, because we're always going to have children who come up to us with errors, but if we're just letting them free write, the truth is they may gain something in terms of stamina, but actually they're not accurate, and that lack of accuracy is going to be a problem throughout. And if children are making lots of spelling errors, I think you then have to really think, well, what do I need to do here? Is it a question of knowledge? Is it a question of giving them more support? Is it a question of giving them some of the spellings that we want them to spell correctly? So which spellings do we actually want them to sound out and write? Which spellings do we want to just give them so they're not just writing out inaccurate spellings over and over again and just hoping they pick up the correct spellings? Now, in terms of teaching spelling, I think my own thinking behind this was that we really do need to try and help children to develop their schema. Clearly, there are those of us who have developed a schema for our spelling. We have it. So what is really going on there? How are we doing this? And I think we haven't got all the answers yet because we don't have nearly enough research into spelling of the kind that would actually be useful to us as teachers. But I think if we go with best bets here and say, well, what are we trying to do with knowledge-rich spelling curriculum? We do want them to develop their schema, and how can we best do that? Using explicit instruction does work. Not asking children to just discover how to spell by themselves, it's not going to happen. Also, while children can make links, I think that we do need to help reinforce those links as well and be quite explicit with that. And that needs to be part of our teaching, that we're helping them to constantly do that so they actually develop that ability themselves. Because again, that's where I think children who are poorer spellers are really struggling, is because they're not making some of those initial links, and because they're not making the initial links, we just kind of carry on, obviously, with our curriculum, but they struggle then to make the sort of more complex links, whereas clearly some children somehow grasp that and kind of carry on developing their schema, carry on making those links, and they just become better and better spellers. And last but not least, and this, you know, a lot of this come from my conversations with Alex Quigley, who's been very, very helpful as well. Really, the sort of the look, cover, right aspect of teaching spelling with a test at the end is not the most effective way of teaching spelling. Now, there are children who naturally somehow pick up spelling, and they grasp the GPCs, they start to develop their schema and they add to it. The same way we can argue the same thing, similar thing for readers. But what we do have is an awful lot of children who aren't doing that. And just rote learning words is not sufficient, any more than rote learning words for reading is sufficient, rote learning words for spelling is insufficient. And the children who are really hampered by this approach are, I'd actually argue some of the children who are very good spellers in theory, in what we would consider the spelling test. So you have the phenomenon of those children who can learn 20 spellings a week and get 20 out of 20 in their spelling test. When it comes to actually their writing, they're either, well, they're not applying it, but not just that they're not applying it, they're also not particularly good spellers in general, it has to be said. So they're actually, they're not really developing their schema, they're not really making their links, they're not adding to anything there, they're still struggling with the basics. And then you've got children who are just struggling to spell full stop. And this rote learning just doesn't seem to work for them at all, because they seem to have nothing to hang on to it. Now, it may be they've got issues with their working memory, it may be there's other problems that we haven't diagnosed and we're not looking at yet, but we need to think of how can we help those children really to move on, because actually just giving them a bunch of words to rote learn is not going to help. Moreover, the fact is they're not learning to pronounce those words sometimes, depending on how much time you've got for spelling. And they're really not moving forward, they're not making the kind of progress that we need them to make, and so they will fall behind their peers, not just in terms of spelling, but overall in their writing as well. So what are we actually teaching? Like I said earlier, if I had it my way, I would get rid of the statutory spellings, because I don't think they're necessarily helpful. I can understand that we wanted some sort of standard or sort of a set of words that we know the children definitely can spell, but actually I'm not sure how helpful they are. But given that we do have this is the national curriculum, this is the expectations, I think we have to work within it. As always, I don't think that even if you want a different end outcome, the way to achieve it is not to change something in school when people are still being held accountable for it. I think the way to do that is to make that argument outside elsewhere, but to really think about, okay, if this is the curriculum that we have, how can we actually teach it best? And so this was a model that I tried more recently, and it was different in the different year groups, because as I can sort of show you, different year groups have got to teach different types of spelling. So it has to be that you have some differences in the way that you're teaching spelling across the different year groups, because it can't be consistent because you don't have the same objectives. So the idea was that you would actually explicitly teach, you'd have daily teaching and you would explicitly teach. So in this case, in year one, you would have, and this would be fairly common across the weeks, because they only have grapheme phoneme correspondences and common exception words. And so you can basically follow this model. Now, the idea behind the dictated sentences was that they would use those spellings. So one of the things that people do is they give children spellings and they ask the children to put them into sentences to show they understand them and they know the meaning of the word. Now, I think that's confusing the teaching of spelling with the teaching of vocabulary. Do you want them to learn how to spell the word, or do you want them to learn the meaning of the word? What do you want them to demonstrate? I think you've got to be really clear in your objective. If you want them to spell the word, you want them to spell it accurately, you have to keep it focused on that. That's not to say that there's no room for teaching children spelling and vocabulary and ask them to use it. However, what I would say is that it doesn't make sense to confuse those objectives as part of a daily spelling lesson, if that's what you're doing. So dictated sentences are really useful because it means that children are not focusing on composition. They are literally just focusing on that sentence, that word within a sentence, and actually writing it out and seeing if they can do that. And also it's really useful because it reinforces the concept of a simple sentence. It can reinforce other vocabulary, and plus it gets them to use their grapheme phoneme correspondences, and that, you know, so that spellings that you might want to check from previous weeks as well. So it's a really good forum for doing that. And you still have a spelling test at the end of the week. But the idea with these spelling tests was that they didn't just consist of the words they were taught that week, but they were also containing words from previous weeks as well. And so what you would have, this is kind of one model, this is one way you could do it, is to say, right, okay, we'll sort of have a week of teaching grapheme phoneme correspondences. And I don't think you can teach grapheme phoneme correspondences for spelling and morphology in exactly the same way. I think you do have to have a slightly different approach for both. And so the first week would be sort of, you know, they'd be taught grapheme phoneme correspondence, they'd be taught some of the statutory spellings, homophones, near homophones, and again the dictated sentences and the test. And then with the prefixes and suffixes, as I'll show later, I wanted them to sort of have a bit more practice, because you want them to develop a bit more understanding of the meaning of these prefixes and suffixes as you teach them, and potentially, like I said, you know, some aspect of the rules as well. There's a slightly different take on this. Now, initially, my thinking was that the best way to do this would be to have rotating weeks, but I have to say, without research, I can't really say that if you block it, it would necessarily be worse. And I think initially, in terms of if you're sort of taking your first steps into really teaching spelling, it probably isn't going to do a massive bit harm to do the blocking. But actually what it would help to do is to support teachers in their ability to teach spelling effectively, if they're not having to sort of go back and forth between the two. Another way that you could do this is to have these sort of blocks, these sort of weeks, and say, right, okay, we're going to have a grapheme phoneme correspondence week, a morphology week, and instead of teaching homophones or near homophones every week, to actually just have specific lessons for that. Again, I don't think we can say that it's set in stone, because we're at the stage that we're at in terms of developing and teaching knowledge-rich spelling curriculums, and that it isn't a set in stone. So I think you do have some flexibility to say, okay, fine, as long as you're explicitly teaching it, is there a sort of a particular best way? Not necessarily right now, and I can't argue that there is, but I do think that you need to be quite clear in terms of what you are teaching though. Now, before we go into all the sort of the more specific lessons, what I would say is that one thing that we need to do is that all these lessons, even if they seem slightly different, what they do have in common is the following things. So what I'm really going to concentrate on when I look at the sort of lessons I would, sort of model lessons I would teach for a grapheme phoneme correspondence, and I'm really thinking of Key Stage 2 here more so than anything else, then these are the common threads of what each lesson would have, even if it's not in quite the same sequence. So there would be explicit instruction. You would be teaching the meaning of the words as much as you can, because I think it is important. You may as well take the opportunity. These aren't just these words aren't just words, you know, they do mean something, and there's no harm in doing that. And also it can give the children a hook as well, and that's part of not just the word origins, so this is where you sort of infuse your etymology, but also in terms of just having sort of little stories to tell about these words, or sort of sets of words, or the grapheme phoneme correspondence. For example, if you've got when you're teaching them the letter string sort of QUE, that grapheme phoneme correspondence, which makes a sound, you know, the fact that it's got a French origin, that's the story that you'd want to tell. Quick quizzing for meaning or for the different parts of the word that you're teaching. The use of mini whiteboards, I don't think this necessarily needs to be done in books. I think a lot of this should be quick fire teaching. And so you would want a lot of show and tell within the lesson. And again, that makes quite easy correction as well for the children. And then to have various sort of scaffolds for the children as well, in terms of leaving up the grapheme phoneme correspondence, or if you've got rare or unusual graphemes in a word the children try and spell, there's nothing wrong with scaffolding it. Now, part of the problem that we have with the teaching of spelling is that it is a very all or nothing approach. Either, like I said, the children are going off and doing it by themselves, or this is me, you know, this is what I would have done in the past, or I would have given them the whole word. And what happens when you give them the whole word all the time is they're not actually having to do the hard work of retrieval. And in most cases, even if you look at words which contain rare and unusual grapheme phoneme correspondences, actually the vast majority of that word the children should know how to spell it. It's only a particular part of it. And I think if we treat it like that, and if you sort of ask children, you know, what is that part, they will tell you. They'll tell you the bit they're struggling with. And it's not the whole thing most of the time. So you do need to sort of put it back on them, make them do some of the work. But that's also how the children will retrieve that knowledge, and that's reinforcing as well. And also, just to link to their prior knowledge, it's really important. But also when you're looking at, say, statutory spellings, it's important to then sort of, when you look at them, you can group them. But sometimes actually it's kind of hard because the whole point is they're sort of relatively random. But what you can do is sort of get to a point of linking with other words they know, and sort of just, again, as part of the quick quizzing, you know, have we come across this graphing phoneme correspondence before? What other words do you know? You can kind of build that in. And having that sense of repeated practice. So even though you look at those daily lessons and say, all right, you're teaching different things each day, actually what you'd be doing is you'd be practicing the same words each day as you go along, and then reinforcing again. So this comes obviously from Rosenshine in particular, the idea that, you know, you'd be bringing in words from previous weeks into your spelling test to see if they can still do that. And actually there's nothing wrong with repeating, with practicing some of those again as well. The idea is that within the lessons they're doing lots of practice, and across the lessons they're doing lots of practice, and then over time they will be practicing as well. And then the importance of feedback and correction, that sort of quick feedback and correction, the ability of children to then be able to just correct themselves and to practice again and to practice correctly is really important in terms of reinforcing that learning. What we don't want is children making spelling errors and repeatedly making spelling errors. Now, there's going to be an element of this because let's just face it, you know, in primary school, children are trying out new words, new vocabulary, and it's going to happen. But what we need to think about in terms of feedback and correction is, can we reasonably expect this child, given what they know already, to be able to spell these words? And if we can, then the children should be spelling them correctly. And we need to hold them to that standard. Otherwise, the children will just fall back or sort of do things or spell words in a way that is phonetically plausible, but actually isn't correct. And I don't think we can sort of say, well, that's okay forever. We have to correct them at some point so that they can actually become better spellers and better writers. And also because we just don't want a situation where the child's written a page and it's just riddled with spelling errors. You know, we don't want children to have that and to have to correct that many spellings either. You know, that in itself is slightly demoralising. So what would I do if I was teaching the grapheme phoneme correspondence? So I'm going to go through this lesson in a bit more detail. With other lessons, I will just focus on a bit that would be slightly different. I think that's the most helpful way to do this. So if we look at, you know, the initial thing, I would just teach children how to pronounce that particular GPC. So in this case, it'd be I would then go through the letters and how it's spelt, and then link it back in with their prior knowledge of that sound, and talk about this got a French origin as well. And then I would do, I would give the children, I would go through words one by one. So I'd have like maybe 3 or 4 words, and I would do my turn, your turn with the words. I would go through the meaning of the word. And now that depends on the word itself. You might want to define that word. You might want to use a picture or a gesture to explain it, depending on the word you're going to do that. And like I said, I mean, initially when you look at this, it feels like, oh, that's a lot to do. But as you start to teach it in this way, it just becomes second nature. And these lessons are actually quite quick. And then depending on whether it's monosyllabic or polysyllabic, you would either, so you get the children to look at the number of syllables and then break it down. And if it is monosyllabic, and so if it is monosyllabic, you would just break the word into its grapheme phoneme correspondences. If it's polysyllabic, and this is where I can honestly say that I wasn't particularly good at teaching these types of words, you break it down into the syllables, and then you break those down into their grapheme phoneme correspondences. And again, this might initially be a bit more of a laborious task while you're teaching the children and while you're starting to do it yourself, but actually over time it becomes quite quick fire, and the children are very good at this anyway. And if you look at sort of the last bit, you would then get the children to then practice it. Now, depending, again, you know, you've got to some extent look at the children that you're teaching. I would probably leave the grapheme phoneme correspondence up on the board, because I want the children to spell that correctly, and I don't want them to have to, you know, I'm not asking children to retrieve it within the space of that lesson. You'd want them to do that over time though. But when it comes to other words, I might leave a bit of the spelling in if I think it's tricky or they're likely to get it wrong, or it's unusual, for example. And that happens more and more when you're teaching, as you'll see when you're teaching statutory spellings. So that would be sort of a standard lesson. With the common exception words, the main difference would be just that the words, the statutory spellings, is that of course we just have these lists of like hundreds of words that children are expected to spell. Now, again, I think, you know, you can sort of say, well, ideally they wouldn't have to, but we do have to teach them these spellings somehow. And also it does have a knock-on effect, particularly for that year 6 teacher, and I've been one recently, because the children are expected to spell these words correctly in their writing, if of course their writing demands it, or it's appropriate to that particular piece. So we do have to find a way of teaching these spellings, and like I said, ideally what we would have had was just us teaching complex code for much longer, but we don't have that situation. So what we need to do is, that if we can group them, we should do it. I also think there's a good cause for saying that where we can split the spellings, those sort of massive spelling lists between year 3 and 4 and between 5 and 6, we should, because getting the children to practice hundreds of words each year is not necessarily the most effective way of getting them to learn those statutory spellings. Sort of splitting them between 2 year groups gives you the ability to practice and really teach them, makes it more manageable, but also means that you can then really ensure that the children are spelling those words correctly. And actually, as a teacher yourself, it's just a much more manageable task. It's much more manageable for the children. The only issue there would be that if you're doing sort of SAT-style GPS tests, of course, they won't take that into account. But that's something that I suppose is an issue for not just you as a teacher. That's something that you need to discuss with SLT, with your English coordinator, and it's something that you need to make a decision on. But I would very much do the same thing as I would do for teaching graphic and phoneme correspondence. I would break the words down, and as you can see, the practice is exactly the same. For home phones and near home phones, I think you do have to teach it slightly differently. Yes, you'd want to, teach the pronunciation. Yes, you'd want to break it down, ensure that children do know the meaning of the words. But I think it's important that you actually use those words in context, because in this case, it really is important, because that's the difference in them knowing when to use that particular spelling. And so what I would do is I would have a section of the lesson where the children would have the words. Now, if it's if you're teaching home phones, there's only 2 of them, this is easier. So you have them writing bear on one side and bear on the other, the 2 different spellings. And they can just show you which one's which, and, sort of say, well, which one is it? And get the children to sort of make that choice and start to understand the difference between them. You can also get the children to actually, you can also use these sentences to get the children to write them in, although I didn't in that particular, when I was teaching it. But it's the same difference. It's just if they're showing you, you can give that quick fire feedback. In terms of teaching morphology, now I love Engelman, I do, and I think that all of his sort of programs are amazing. The only thing I would say about his program for teaching morphemes is that while I've seen teachers, secondary teachers, talk about it and use it, we do have a situation here that's slightly different. Secondary teachers don't have the specific spelling objectives that we do, and as with all programs, if we're importing them from elsewhere, we do need to make sure that we are able to cover the objectives. Like I said, we can have these great ideas, that's fine, we can import these things in, that's fine, but we do still have to cover the national curriculum, and if there's certain aspects missing, someone's going to have to be that person who has to fill them in. And I am really, really conscious of the year 6 teacher who's sitting there going, okay, so which of these weren't taught? So I do think that for all the, we don't want to treat this like a fad and go, yes, this will solve everything. If you're going to use a program like that, you must really look through it and check through it and make sure that it is covering everything. Now, I didn't do that. I didn't break it down the same way that I did for the writing revolution and expressive writing, but just flicking through it, I could see that actually it wasn't sufficient. Whether you can then use the techniques in there to teach morphology, the other sort of morphology objectives, I don't know. So I'm not going to pretend that that's something I looked into in a lot of depth, because I haven't. And if I did, maybe I would change my mind. But when it came to actually teaching morphology sort of more recently, this is kind of how I did it. And again, you've got my turn, your turn. But I sort of taught morphology in 2 ways, so the prefixes in 2 ways. I had spent one day where I just went through it, and even though I didn't use Freya diagrams, I do think this is sort of like where they can really be handy and useful. And what I would introduce next, if I was to when I teach it again, is to have the Freya diagram there, and really to go through it. You know, what is the prefix? What does it mean? Because it's really important. And then to look at examples and non-examples for prefixes. This is really important because the children will encounter lots of words, and some of those words will have that sort of nominally will have the prefix, but actually it's not a prefix in the context of that word. And we have to make sure that we know that we give this knowledge to the children. There are these words out there, so they're not just assuming that. So when they are using the morphological elements of this to help maybe understand a word, that they're not assuming that it's the case in all cases, and we sort of build that in right from the start. And in terms of teaching it on the first day, I would very much make sure that the prefix has got a different colour or is in some way marked out slightly differently in this situation, because here the real emphasis is on meaning, not on the teaching of the spelling of it. As you can see, the teaching of the spelling of it is no different to the teaching and spelling of any of the other words. You break it down again. And within those words, if you have rare grapheme phoneme correspondences, again, I would put them up on the board and give them to the children. But part of knowing how to scaffold the spelling is actually you sort of building up your knowledge of what you're teaching the children as well, because as you go along, you know what to leave up there and you know what not to. In terms of suffixes, this is where you really have to think about, do I want to teach a spelling rule? Do I not want to teach a spelling rule? Is that going to be helpful or not? My gut instinct is that teaching sort of lists of spellings that are similar makes sense. And the reason why I brought up this particular objective is because while you can do the same thing in terms of talking about its origins, actually when you break it down in terms of its sounds, it's not, that suffix has more than one grapheme phoneme correspondence within it. And so you don't want to teach it just as a chunk, as a visual chunk. You know, in terms of spelling, you want to link it back into what they know. And to link it back into what they know, you need to go back to the GPCs. But here, for example, with sort of magician, logician, electrician, actually you can kind of argue there's a rule there, but then when you look at other words, there's not really a rule. You can kind of explain what's going on there. But again, I'm not sure what value that is or how much time you really want to spend on that. Is it really valuable to talk about changing the Y to an I in the case of a beautician? Is that really a rule? Is that happening often enough? And in other cases, say a word like mortician, actually you'd have to really look at it. It's not so much the rule, you'd really have to look at the etymology behind that word in a bit more depth, because it's not going to make sense to the children, because it's not straightforward, here's a root word, here's a suffix, stick it together. And again, I would break it down in the exact same way. So you can see there is a lot of repetition in terms of how it is taught, even if the structure of the lesson is slightly different. In terms of sort of the Holy Grail, how can we actually build up a spelling curriculum in the long term? I think from my experience of doing it in a sort of the first iteration of doing it, I would say that the coverage for this, I think you really do need to ensure the national curriculum coverage is there. I think that's really important. But also that teachers and support staff do have the phonic knowledge. I think the knowledge aspect of it for teachers is where it can be missing, and particularly in Key Stage 2. I have to be honest, you know, as a Key Stage 2 teacher, I didn't have much training in it at all. It was only when I went into Key Stage 1 that I had training, and I had to build on that over time. And even then it took me quite a bit of time. So I think we really need to think, well, if we're going to teach spelling in this particular way, we do need to make sure that all staff develop their phonic knowledge all the way across, and it's not just a Key Stage 1 thing. I would, like I said, with hindsight, I would block the GPCs and the morphological elements. I think that's important. Initially, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, but I think in terms of teaching it, it helps to sort of really develop one aspect of that teaching really, really well, so you can then sort of move on from that in the long term. Because going back and forth in those initial stages is quite hard, because you're having to sort of, it's not hard, it's not difficult for the children, I think, it's just hard if you're building up your own knowledge and you're trying to develop a new way of teaching it. But I would say that we need to try and make sure that spelling is taught daily, even if it's just in short bursts, and that it's still important to test it weekly and over time. I then would think that, you know, if we're developing a sort of wider knowledge-rich curriculum, what else do we want to happen here? Well, we do want to include the words from your curriculum overall. I don't think you can do that in the first iteration, because I think you really need to sort of just make sure that the basics of national curriculum are covered. But I do think it's important to then say, well, we've got this wider curriculum and we do want the children to spell those words correctly and not just give it to them, and to sort of include those words as part of any sort of word list that you have. And then start to interleave the different weeks. I do think that it would make sense to do that, and I think it's better for the children not just have blocks of one and blocks of the other, although the fact that you're going through the GPCs in each case would be helpful. I am moving more and more towards the idea that we do need to have grapheme phoneme correspondence checks across Key Stage 2. I think it's really important both for their reading and for their spelling, and overall for their reading and their writing. And then if I was to have a step 3, you know, in terms of the iterations, because I think what we really need to be honest about is when we're doing any kind of knowledge-rich curriculum, there's not just going to be one iteration. It's not a one-off event that's going to happen, that's it, everything's perfect. This isn't a fad. It's not a silver bullet. It's something we need to think about over time. And as we get more research, we need to try and look at that and say, how can we incorporate these different elements? And so, you know, one of the things I would do is make sure that every year group reteaches the objectives of previous year groups. Because I think it is important. Again, we can't have it that children are only given like one chance to learn these, some of these grapheme phoneme correspondences. We know that children are at different stages in their reading. Also, I think just for children in terms of building up their schema, they do need to go over those objectives again. There's so many objectives in primary that I just think we've underestimated the amount of practice it takes to really embed these. And I think we need to go back to this idea that actually we need to reteach as a matter of fact, not because the person who taught it initially did not teach it well, but just because the sheer amount of time that it takes to actually practice and embed some of this knowledge is huge. And actually some of the basic knowledge takes a long time to embed. You can do all sorts of amazing things once it is embedded, but it does need to be embedded, and reteaching previous objectives, not so much see it as a failure of anybody, but actually just this is the nature of it. You know, this is the nature of learning GPCs. This is the nature, and the same thing I would say about sentence construction as well. It's the nature of simple sentences. It just takes a long time to learn, a lot of practice. And then to sort of, you know, have tests each week, each month that are sort of do that in a much more systematic way. I don't think you can do that initially when you first implement it, but I think you can do it over time. And also just sort of have that feedback of like, hey, now what are the key words? What are the spellings that we know the children are getting wrong over and over again, and really embed those in terms of the teaching and also over time in terms of the testing, so that we are ensuring that children aren't, you know, leaving primary school with their confusions in those still. And then just to revise a list of GPCs taught, because you've got your curriculum, you know, what words you've got, and are some grapheme phoneme correspondences, even if they're rare, are they coming out more common because of your wider curriculum and you need to explicitly teach them? And so, you know, you sort of have this process of revision of the curriculum. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Tarjinder. Really interesting, particularly from my perspective as a secondary English teacher. So I had lots of questions, but actually people have sent in questions, so I'd like to start with them. Okay. It's nearly the end of the slot as well.
Yeah, I know.
But if you don't mind, I'll ask a few more questions. First of all, many people are asking, will you be making a presentation available to us?
Yes. Yeah, no, I will. Yeah.
So we'll make sure that we share that. Okay, so what would you suggest should be the method for teaching spelling going to secondary school? And that's very similar to other questions related to lower attaining students in year 7 who might not have managed to master those skills and that knowledge by the time they join their secondary school.
I think you're going to see, and you do it in primary school, you see it in primary school, you're going to see it in secondary school. Their spelling is going to be very much linked to their knowledge of grapheme phoneme correspondences, okay? So that it is, so you've got to see this as a bit more holistic than and just spelling by itself. Actually, what's going on with their reading as well, you know, like, so marry that up, because that's probably the best way to support children with their spelling, is to actually marry the two things up. So if you know where they're at with their with their reading, then you'll also know where they're at with their spelling, and their spelling will be slightly more delayed than their reading, as is the case even in primary. So I think in terms of teaching, I think you do have to go for that explicit model. I think if you think about what is the prior knowledge that you can link it to, and actually, like I said, if you treat spelling as just a visual thing, there's really doing nothing to link it too much. And that's where you look for the patterns and things, and that's fine. But actually, it's not really helping the child who's confused by this, because to some extent they can do that. But like I said, it just becomes confusing quite early on. It becomes quite confusing for us as adults. We tie ourselves up in knots. So linking it back to those grapheme phoneme correspondences makes the most sense, because that's where their knowledge will be strongest. Even if they're struggling, they will have some knowledge of phonics. And so you can link it into there.
Okay, well, I would, as an English teacher in secondary school, I would definitely need to beef up my knowledge of phonics, because it's not very strong, and that's probably a problem as well.
I'd say that's true for Key Stage 2 onwards. I think honestly, I think if we're going to, both for reading and for spelling, I think we do have to have much more training. I think it's just becoming, for me anyway, it's just clearer and clearer that we do need to have that as part of our teacher training for all of us, because we just need to know it. It's so fundamental that we can't do without it. And what happens when we don't have it is that we end up going down these routes, which I did for most of my early career. So, like I said, all the mistakes, all the misconceptions that I've outlined, I've had them at one point or another. But you can also see why it becomes so difficult to actually teach spelling then, because you've got all of this stuff in your head. So how can you? And to make it clearer in your own head, having the knowledge will make it simpler in terms of knowing what the steps are and how to scaffold spellings across the curriculum, and not just, sort of when you're teaching it to them as a basic skill.
I'm always a bit surprised to find out that the kids don't really have a knowledge of some of the, what I would consider quite basic spelling rules. I mean, as an EAL speaker myself, I've obviously learned quite a few rules when it comes to writing English. So something like the double consonant, that would be preceded by a short sound, and those kinds of things. When I try to explain that to the children, they don't seem to know about those rules. Something as simple as adding a prefix to a root word. You don't change the spelling of the prefix, you don't change the spelling of the root word, so you might end up with a double consonant. Those things I find that they're not really aware of, and they seem to be quite quick wins.
Yeah, I would argue that that's probably more the function of the look, cover, write. It is that testing of spelling, that rote learning of spelling. And when we teach it, I don't, and this is something I'll accuse myself of. Like I said, there is a place for spelling rules. I think there is a place for looking at them and for having those kind of word lists when you're teaching morphology. But sometimes it's almost overemphasized at the expense of teaching the word, if that makes sense, and linking it in with prior knowledge. So there is that aspect to it. And also just the knowledge of phonics and like you say, the different types of sounds and so not having that all sort of in one place and seeing that as a kind of overall body of knowledge, I think is part of the issue too. Because like I said, when I was trying to teach myself, I was just getting different aspects. I was just pulling in different aspects from different places. And that's not a way to learn how to teach spelling in primary or secondary. And in some way I can understand, like, sort of MFL teachers probably be more okay with this. And you'd think that as English teachers or people who teach English, they would, but actually it's not necessarily out there in the same way. But like I said, when you get into the rote learning aspect of it, that's where it goes. Even if you teach them the rule as such, it's only going to be a one-off event, which is why it's important that we teach and reteach these spellings and teach some of these rules and ideas over and over again, because the notion that you can just have this one-off amazing lesson, the children will get it, I think it really hampers children's learning. It doesn't matter how amazing that lesson was. There are some things that just require repeated teaching. I think we just need to accept that. We just need to, and probably in secondary as well, it may be frustrating, but actually possibly with certain aspects of the knowledge, we're just going to have to accept, in order for children to really grasp it, we need to teach it repeatedly over time, and it needs to be retaught, and children just need to, it just does take a long time to learn certain
particularly if those mistakes have been internalized. You were talking about how practice makes permanent, and that's certainly the case. I mean, you point out to some students, you've made the same mistake here again, we've already corrected it, you understood the last time why it was a mistake, and yet they still make the mistake because it's so ingrained. It's very, very difficult to unlearn a spelling mistake that they've been practicing for a long time. A couple of things. Are there any books you would recommend reading or further courses to pursue to help with our knowledge of teaching spelling?
I believe that, like John Walker is doing a online Sounds Right course, which I would recommend. I mean, I did actually go on his course a couple of years ago, and I learned so much from that. On top of that, you've got sort of Debbie Hepplewhite's, in like her website. In terms of just learning the basic phonic knowledge, I think that's really important. Like I said, because if they don't have that, actually, if you think about when you're talking about spelling rules and stuff, actually none of that's going to make sense either. You know, none of that's going to make sense if you don't actually understand the phonic aspect of it. So I would really say start off there, and really sort of support your own knowledge. And once you sort of understand that, you can then move on. Again, I think it's going to take a bit of time for us, and I'm still, you know, I'm not going to say I'm at the right at the end of it, and I've got all the knowledge that I need, and I can just, because I think it's going to take time to build up that knowledge and really know how to teach some of these spelling objectives well. I think we're still not completely there, because I don't think we've had that focus on the knowledge in quite the same way. And as we start to focus on the knowledge, actually that brings up other issues. Actually, what is the best way to explain this? What is the best way to teach it? But I think that the initial point is just for you to feel confident as a teacher that you've got the knowledge that you need. I think we can then develop things, you know, over time.
Yeah, there are also some very useful I can't recall top of my head what they are, but some very useful websites on teaching prefixes and suffixes, root words, origins, but you know, etymology. And I know I've used that with young students before, and it's really, really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, if you sort of put in sort of etymology dictionaries and things like that, like you know, what's out there is really quite useful. There is a lot in terms of the actual knowledge, the specific knowledge. I think that's easy to get if you know what you're looking for, as always with Google.
Someone was asking, is it important for Key Stage 3 teachers to revise and test GPCs in Year 7? I'm not sure. I think we've kind of covered that, because I don't think I would necessarily have the knowledge to do so. My question around the spelling lists that you mentioned quite a few times in terms of the national curriculum and, you know, the statutory spellings they have to learn. I don't have a solid knowledge of what they are, and I remember downloading them before, but it just strikes me that I should know what they are.
You know, I don't blame secondary teachers for not knowing what they are. I think they're fairly arbitrary. So in terms of usefulness, I would say the two things that would be useful are the GPCs and the morphological elements. That's the really useful stuff. So I wouldn't necessarily go down that route, like whether they've learnt them or not. I mean, is it really that important? I mean, what you want is their ability to spell overall. What's going to help them do that? And knowing this list of spellings, which effectively a lot of children are rote learning, if they can't do it, that's not because, okay, if they don't know those words, what does that actually indicate? The issue with their spelling is something else still. Do you know what I mean? So actually, the fact they can't spell them is not going to necessarily be a case of, it's not telling you anything other than they can't spell the word. So that doesn't necessarily lead you anywhere specific with their teaching, I don't think.
Okay, I think we're going to have to bring it to a close because we've gone over time. It was really, really interesting. Thank you so much, because I still have questions for you, but we can carry on that conversation at some other point.
No problems.
So thank you very much for your time this morning, Tarjinder.
Thank you.
Lots of people have been asking questions, so I will send you the questions as well.
Okay.
And if we could share the PowerPoint, that would be really brilliant.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Have a great day. Thank you,
you
very
too.
much.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
Right, everyone, we'll see you again tomorrow with Cat's Gut, and we'll be talking about CPD. We'll be talking about collaborating teachers in order to make effective professional learning. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.